In the vast, tumultuous ocean of history, there are waves that crash upon the shore with thunderous force. Their names, revolution, empire, war, forever etched into the landscape of our memory. These are the stories of the titans, the Caesars, and the czars, the visionaries and the villains who command the grand stage. But the ocean is deep, and in its silent, sunless fathoms move other currents, other lives, swept along by the same tides, but whose stories are rarely told. These are the tales of survival in the wake of the storm, of lives defined not by the crowns they wore, but by the shattering loss of a world they were born to inherit. Today we delve into one such story, a life lived in the long, melancholic shadows of fallen eagles and vanished thrones. It is the story of Grand Duchess Kirillovna of Russia, a Romanov princess whose very existence was a paradox. Born into exile, raised as the daughter of an emperor with no empire, and married into a dynasty that had also lost its crown, her life was a testament to the immense, crushing weight of legacy. Hers is not a tale of dramatic political intrigue or fairy tale romance. It is a more intimate, more profoundly human narrative, a quiet exploration of duty, displacement, and the slow creeping ache of disappointment that can settle over a life, even one adorned with the most illustrious of names. Join us as we piece together the poignant, fragmented portrait of a princess who bridged two shattered worlds, only to find herself a stranger in both, a woman whose quiet sorrow tells us more about the true cost of history than any grand monument. A legacy of defiance, the scandal that created Kira. To truly understand the woman Kira became, dutiful, reserved, and tinged with a permanent melancholy, we must first pull back the heavy velvet curtains on the extraordinary, tempestuous love story that brought her into the world. Her existence was not the product of a calculated dynastic alliance, sealed with a cold handshake between nations. No, she was born from a passionate rebellion, a love so fierce and inconvenient that it shook the very foundations of the rigid Russian court. Her parents were two of the most glamorous, headstrong, and visually striking figures in European royalty, Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich of Russia and Princess Victoria Melita of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Grand Duke Kirill was every inch the Romanov ideal. A grandson of the revered Tsar Liberator Alexander II, he was a tall, impossibly handsome naval officer with the unmistakable bearing of a man born to command. His life was mapped out for him, a distinguished career serving the Tsar, a suitable marriage to a foreign princess, and a life of immense privilege and unwavering duty to the throne. But the heart rarely consults a map. His great love, Princess Victoria Melita, known to her intimate circle as Ducky, was a woman of entirely different energy. A granddaughter of Great Britain's formidable Queen Victoria, Ducky was a true product of the intricate web of European royal kinship, yet she possessed a spirit that refused to be constrained by it. She was fiercely intelligent, a gifted and passionate artist with a talent for painting, and she carried herself with an imperious air that could be captivating to some and utterly infuriating to others. The problem was not their station, for both were of the highest rank. The problem was their proximity in blood. Kirill and Ducky were first cousins, a union strictly forbidden by the Russian Orthodox Church and viewed as anathema by the court. Their love story was not a fleeting fancy. It was a deep, persistent current that flowed beneath the surface of their lives for years. They had been drawn to each other as adolescents, but the unblinking machinery of royal matchmaking had other plans for Ducky. At the tender age of 17, she was steered into a disastrous marriage with another of her first cousins, the sensitive and gentle Ernst, Grand Duke of Hesse. The political logic was impeccable. Ernst was the brother of the woman who would become Russia's last empress, Alexandra Feodorovna. The marriage was meant to further cement the bonds between the great royal houses, but on a human level, it was a catastrophe. Ernst and Ducky were polar opposites. He was an introverted aesthete, a man who preferred quiet pursuits and the company of a few close friends. Ducky was a passionate, demanding extrovert who craved excitement and a deep, all-consuming romance. Their life together at the court of Darmstadt was one of stifling incompatibility and growing misery. Ducky complained of a profound lack of emotional and physical connection, feeling trapped and utterly alone. The final heartbreaking blow to their union came with the tragic death of their only child, a beloved daughter named Elizabeth, from typhoid. After that loss, the marriage was nothing more than an empty shell. Ducky was determined to escape. Her desire for a divorce sent shock waves through the royal courts of Europe. It was a scandal of the first order, a public admission of failure that polite society simply did not permit. The person most horrified by this was her sister-in-law, the Tsarina Alexandra. Alexandra was a woman of deep, unbending piety and rigid moral convictions. She saw Ducky's actions as a selfish, immoral betrayal of her brother and a stain on the sanctity of marriage. An unshakable animosity grew between the two women, a personal feud that would have devastating consequences. The Tsarina would never forgive Ducky, and her influence over her husband, Tsar Nicholas II, was immense. When Ducky, finally free from her miserable marriage, turned back to the man she had loved all along, Grand Duke Kirill, she walked directly into the Tsarina's line of fire. Kirill, for his part, had remained devoted to her throughout her ordeal. Now, he was determined to make her his wife, regardless of the consequences. They found themselves facing an insurmountable wall of opposition, with the Empress leading the charge. Tsar Nicholas II, a man who prized family harmony and was deeply influenced by his wife's powerful will, was caught in the middle. He demanded that Kirill end the relationship, reminding him of his duty to the throne and the explicit religious prohibition. But Kirill, like his beloved Ducky, possessed a stubborn, romantic streak that overrode his sense of duty. He had waited long enough. Choosing love over his career, his fortune, and his standing with the Tsar, he defied his sovereign. In 1905, while abroad, the couple traveled to a small chapel in Tegernsee, Bavaria, and were quietly married. The Tsar's retribution was swift and merciless. When news of the blatant defiance reached St. Petersburg, Nicholas was enraged. An imperial manifesto was issued. Kirill was stripped of his imperial titles, cashiered from the navy he loved, and had his vast allowances cut off. He was formally banished from Russia, declared a traitor to his family's code. It was in this state of disgrace, living in the fashionable but spiritually alienating exile of Paris, that the couple began their new life. It was here, after the birth of their first daughter, Maria, that their second child, another daughter, was born on May 9th, 1909. They named her Kira. From her very first breath, Kira was a child of defiance, a living symbol of her parents' rebellion. She was a Romanov Grand Duchess born not in the malachite-lined halls of the Winter Palace, but in a rented Parisian townhouse. She was an insider by blood, an outsider by decree. This sense of having a claim to a world from which one was barred, of being both royal and rejected, would become a defining characteristic of her entire life, a quiet, foundational note of melancholy that would never truly fade. However, the unforgiving calculus of royal succession soon intervened with an almost Shakespearean sense of timing. A series of deaths within the Romanov family dramatically altered the line of succession. The Tsar's beloved son, the Tsarevich Alexei, suffered from hemophilia, his life hanging by a thread. The Tsar's own brother, Grand Duke Michael, was considered by many to be the next in line, but he too would soon disqualify himself by entering into a morganatic marriage. Suddenly, Kirill, the disgraced exile, became the third in line to the Russian throne. He was no longer a disposable relative, he was a strategic necessity. Politics, not forgiveness, paved the way for their return. In 1910, Tsar Nicholas, recognizing the pragmatic need to secure the dynasty's future, relented. He restored Kirill's titles and, with a heavy heart, allowed the family to return to Russia. Young Kira, barely a toddler, was brought to St. Petersburg, to the magnificent Kirill Palace on Glinka Street. The reception they received was formally correct but emotionally icy, especially from the Tsarina. They were back in the fold, but they would always be viewed with a degree of suspicion as the family that had broken the rules. For a few brief, glittering years, Kira was given a taste of the life she was born for. It was a fantastical world of nannies in starched white uniforms, of priceless Fabergé eggs appearing at Easter, of exhilarating sleigh rides through the snow-covered parks of Tsarskoe Selo, wrapped in sable furs. She was an imperial highness, a cherished part of the grand, seemingly eternal pageant of the Romanov dynasty. But this world, which she was just beginning to know, a world her parents had fought so hard to re-enter, was living on borrowed time. The ground beneath the opulent palaces was already trembling, and the revolution that would sweep it all away into a vortex of blood and fire was drawing perilously near. The great unraveling, revolution, and a desperate flight. The year 1917 was the year the world broke. For an 8-year-old girl like Kira, it must have been a time of profound and terrifying confusion, a whirlwind of incomprehensible changes that tore the fabric of her reality. The majestic, orderly city of St. Petersburg, a place of imperial processions and ringing church bells, dissolved into a chaotic swirl of street demonstrations, bread riots, and mutinies. The familiar sight of imperial eagles on buildings was suddenly replaced by jarring swaths of red fabric. The clip-clop of horses pulling elegant carriages gave way to the rumble of military trucks filled with grim-faced soldiers and the menacing sound of angry crowds. The whispers of discontent that had always haunted the gilded edges of Romanov life crescendoed into a deafening roar that could no longer be ignored. In the icy grip of the February Revolution, the 300-year-old dynasty, which had seemed as permanent and immovable as the Russian winter, collapsed in a matter of days. Tsar Nicholas II, isolated and overwhelmed, abdicated his throne. In this moment of supreme crisis, Kira's father, Grand Duke Kirill, a man caught between his ingrained loyalty to the institution of the monarchy and his pragmatic assessment of the unfolding disaster, made a fateful decision. In what he likely saw as a pragmatic, last-ditch attempt to save the crown by steering it towards a constitutional model, he marched his loyal naval guards to the Tauride Palace, the seat of the new provisional government. There, he pledged his allegiance to the new order. To signify this shift, his men wore revolutionary red bands on the sleeves of their uniforms. To his detractors within the fiercely loyal monarchist camp, particularly the formidable Dowager Empress Marie Feodorovna, this was an unforgivable act of treason. It was seen not as pragmatism, but as a craven betrayal of his sacred oath to the Tsar, his own cousin. He was branded the Red Grand Duke, a stain that would follow him for the rest of his life. In their eyes, by lending the gravitas of his Romanov name to the revolution, he legitimized the forces that had overthrown the autocracy and hastened its demise. To his defenders, however, it was a desperate gamble by a patriot to prevent the nation from sliding into total anarchy and a bloody civil war. Whatever his motivation, it did not secure his family's safety. As the months wore on, the initial almost festive euphoria of the revolution curdled into a more sinister and violent reality. The provisional government was weak and ineffectual, and real power in the streets was rapidly falling into the hands of the most radical factions, chiefly Lenin's Bolsheviks. The atmosphere grew thick with menace. Kirill and his family were now living in a state of suspended terror. It became terrifyingly clear that anyone bearing the name Romanov was not just a political opponent, but a class enemy marked for annihilation. Having already experienced the sting of exile, Kirill and his wife Victoria were perhaps more attuned to the shifting political winds than their relatives who had never known anything but absolute security. Victoria, in particular, a practical and clear-eyed survivor, saw the rising tide of xenophobia and radicalism and knew with chilling certainty that they had to get out. Her resolve was hardened by the fact that she was pregnant. In the midst of this chaos, in August of 1917, she gave birth to a son, Vladimir. The birth of a male heir, an event that should have been a moment of pure joy, was instead shrouded in fear for his future. In the early summer of 1917, just before the Bolsheviks would seize absolute power and unleash their systematic Red Terror, the family fled. This was not a stately departure with trunks packed by servants. It was a desperate, clandestine escape planned in secret. They traveled with minimal luggage to avoid suspicion, sewing what remaining jewels and precious objects they could into the linings of their clothes. These were not adornments anymore. They were their only hope for survival. We can only imagine the scene through a child's eyes, the frantic, whispered packing in the dead of night, the solemn closure of a great house that had been their home, the palpable fear of armed guards at every checkpoint, and the chilling uncertainty of their destination. Each encounter with a revolutionary patrol was a life-or-death gamble. They made their way across the border into the Grand Duchy of Finland, finding refuge at Heiko Manor, a summer estate. They had escaped with their lives, but their entire world had been shattered. The reality of their new life was a brutal and relentless education for Kira. The opulent security of the Kirill Palace, with its army of servants and endless luxuries, was replaced by a grim day-to-day struggle for survival. In her memoirs, Kira's mother, Victoria, painted a vivid and humiliating picture of their hardship. They were plagued by a constant gnawing hunger that became the central focus of their existence. Food was scarce and ruinously expensive. The grandeur of the Romanovs was reduced to the mortifying necessity of Victoria bartering her precious hidden jewels, piece by piece, with wary locals just to afford flour, potatoes, and a little milk for the children. Imagine the pride of a Grand Duke like Kirill being forced to watch his wife, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, engage in such transactions to keep their family from starving. Kira and her older sister Maria, once dressed in the finest imported silks and lace, now wore simple, repeatedly patched-up clothes against the biting Finnish cold. For Kirill, the loss of his naval career, his very purpose in life, was a source of deep, unspoken depression. He would spend his days pacing the confines of the estate, a powerful man rendered utterly powerless. This abrupt and cruel descent from the pinnacle of privilege to a life of precarious scarcity instilled in Kira a deep-seated sense of insecurity and a permanent, visceral awareness of how quickly and completely a world could be lost. It was during this bleak period of isolation and uncertainty in Finland that the news they had all feared, the news that defied belief, finally reached them. In the summer of 1918, they learned that Tsar Nicholas II, Empress Alexandra, and their 5 children had been brutally murdered in a cellar in Ekaterinburg. The news was a death knell for the old Russia. It was a horrific final confirmation that there was no going back. This wasn't a political defeat. It was a sacrilegious massacre. For Kirill, the weight of the dynasty now fell upon his shoulders with terrifying force. For Kira, the world of her birth was not just gone. It had been violently, sadistically annihilated, transforming her family from mere exiles into the hunted survivors of a martyred dynasty. A ghost crown, a childhood in the court of exile. The murder of the Tsar and his son, the Tsarevich Alexei, was an act of such finality that it fundamentally altered the landscape of the shattered dynasty. In its bloody aftermath, by the ancient laws of succession, Kira's father, Grand Duke Kirill, was now the senior male member of the house and the rightful heir to a throne that no longer existed. He initially assumed the cautious title of curator of the Russian throne, a holding position that allowed him to act as a rallying point for the fragmented monarchist cause without making a direct personal claim. But as the years passed and the Bolshevik regime in Russia solidified its power, gaining recognition from foreign governments, Kirill felt that caution was a luxury the cause could no longer afford. He feared the Romanov legacy would simply fade into memory. And so, in 1924, he took the final decisive step. He formally issued a manifesto from his exile in France, proclaiming himself emperor and autocrat of all the Russias, Kirill I. For the governments of the world, preoccupied with post-war reconstruction and the new realities of Soviet power, this was a hollow, meaningless gesture from a forgotten refugee. But for his family, and for the 15-year-old Kira, it changed everything. This single act transformed their exile from a temporary state of refuge into a permanent ideological mission. She was no longer just a displaced princess. She was an imperial highness, the daughter of the rightful Tsar, a living symbol of a true Russia that existed only in their hearts and in the fierce, unwavering loyalty of a small, dwindling band of fellow émigrés. This phantom crown, invisible to the rest of the world, would cast a long, heavy shadow over her entire life, shaping her education, her responsibilities, her sense of self, and her future prospects in ways both profound and profoundly limiting. Her youth became a map of European cities, each a temporary stop in their long, rootless journey. After the raw survival of Finland, the family lived for a time in Coburg, Germany, the ancestral home of her mother's family. Here, in a nation itself defeated and impoverished after the First World War, they were surrounded by a strange society of ghosts, deposed German princes, dukes, and minor kings, all clinging desperately to their lost titles and reminiscing about a world that was gone forever. It was a world steeped in nostalgia and a sense of bitter irrelevance, a poor training ground for a young woman who would need to navigate the modern world. Eventually, the family found a more permanent home, a place that would become their anchor. They settled in Saint-Bréat-sur-Mer, a small, unassuming fishing village on the rugged coast of Brittany in France. The salt spray of the Atlantic was a world away from the gilded halls of St. Petersburg. They bought a villa, which they named Kur Arganid, and it was here that the surreal court of Kirillovna was established. Life in Saint-Briac was a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance. They lived in a relatively modest house, but within its walls they maintained the full, strict etiquette of the Russian imperial court. A room was designated the throne room, and loyalist visitors would be granted audiences, bowing and kissing hands as if they were in the Winter Palace itself. Kirill issued imperial decrees that had no legal force, bestowing titles upon his supporters and managing the intricate politics of his phantom empire. The old imperial holidays and religious feasts were observed with solemn, unwavering precision. For Kira and her older sister Maria, it was an incredibly insular and bizarre upbringing. Their mother, the formidable Victoria, a woman who had once dazzled the courts of Europe, now poured her immense energy into maintaining this bubble of imperial dignity. A talented artist herself, she ensured her daughters were fluent in Russian, English, French, and German, well-read, and accomplished in the arts. But it was an education for a world that no longer existed. Their history lessons focused on the glory of the Romanovs. Their social training prepared them for roles at a court that was a phantom. They were taught to believe without question in the absolute legitimacy of their father's claim, to see themselves as the sacred vessels of a true Russia, waiting for the day of its miraculous restoration. Kira grew into a young woman of striking yet subtle beauty, with fair hair and large, expressive blue eyes that were often described by observers as carrying the characteristic Romanov melancholy, a look of deep, ancient sadness. This was where the differences between her and her sister became stark. Maria, the elder, was more outgoing, more vivacious, and increasingly rebellious. She chafed under the restrictions of their strange life and yearned for the freedom and normalcy of other young women her age. Kira, in contrast, was quiet, introverted, and deeply, almost painfully, dutiful. She became the sensible, level-headed one, the daughter who understood the immense weight of their situation. While her father was absorbed in the politics of his imaginary empire and her sister dreamed of escape, it was Kira who took on the practical responsibilities of the household. She learned to manage the accounts and became the primary caretaker for her mother, whose health was beginning to fail under the accumulated strain. She internalized the immense, unspoken pressure of her position. To be the daughter of the emperor meant that her behavior had to be flawless, her dedication absolute. It was a role that stole her youth, leaving little room for the normal frivolities, rebellions, and explorations of a young woman's life. Her social life was profoundly, almost comically, restricted. Who, after all, was considered a suitable companion, or more importantly, a potential husband for the daughter of the self-proclaimed Tsar? Many of the remaining royal houses of Europe, walking a diplomatic tightrope, were wary of antagonizing the powerful Soviet Union and refused to officially recognize Kirill's claim. To entertain a marriage proposal for his daughter would be a political endorsement they were unwilling to make. The Romanov émigré community itself, which should have been their support, was bitterly divided. Many powerful monarchists, led by the formidable Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, rejected Kirill's authority, condemning him for his betrayal in 1917 or disputing his claim on complex dynastic grounds. This vicious infighting left the family isolated, even within their own community of exiles. For Kira, it meant that her pool of potential suitors was almost non-existent. She was a princess trapped in a gilded cage built not of palace walls, but of her own magnificent, controversial, and deeply problematic heritage. A union of fallen eagles, a marriage of dynastic logic. As Kira entered her late 20s, a gentle but persistent anxiety began to settle over her family's small court in Saint-Briac. The question of her marriage became a source of growing concern for her parents. In the rarefied world of European royalty, even for a generation living in exile, an unmarried princess of her age was seen as a quiet failure, a loose thread in the dynastic tapestry. A suitable match was needed not just for Kira's personal future, but for the continuation of their grand, if theoretical, dynastic ambitions. The problem was their very pride created an impossible paradox. Her parents, Kirill and Victoria, would never countenance a marriage they deemed beneath their daughter's imperial status. Yet the few remaining reigning royal houses of Europe saw a marriage into Kirill's controversial court as a political liability they were unwilling to assume. An early whispered romance with a handsome Romanian aristocrat had been swiftly and firmly dismissed as unsuitable. For a time, the popular press, ever hopeful for a fairy tale, linked her name with the glamorous Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII of Great Britain. But this was more fantasy than reality. Kira was caught in a cruel catch-22. Her magnificent imperial title made her too grand for most aristocratic suitors, but the very hollowness of that title made her an unappealing prospect for the handful of princes who would have been deemed her equal. Then, as if drawn from the pages of a historical novel, a perfect candidate emerged from the wreckage of another fallen empire. He was a man whose personal history mirrored her own in uncanny ways, a prince who could understand her unique and burdensome position like no one else on earth, Prince Louis Ferdinand of Prussia. Louis Ferdinand was the grandson and heir of the exiled German emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II. The proud house of Hohenzollern had suffered a fate identical to the Romanovs, swept from power in the revolutionary wave that followed the First World War. But Louis Ferdinand was far from a typical stiff-collared German prince of the old school. He was a surprisingly modern, thoughtful, and complex figure. As a young man, he had chafed under the rigid expectations of his family and the stuffy, backward-looking atmosphere of his grandfather's court in exile. With a remarkable force of will, he persuaded the old Kaiser to allow him to live and work in the United States. In a move that was almost unthinkable for a European royal of his stature at the time, he didn't just attend lectures at a university. He took a job on the assembly line at a Ford factory in Detroit. He got his hands dirty, lived on a modest salary, and reveled in the freedom and anonymity of American life. He became a genuine friend of Henry Ford, socialized with Franklin D. Roosevelt, and moved in cosmopolitan circles that were a world away from the suffocating etiquette of European courts. He was intelligent, charming, fluent in several languages, and his time in America had solidified his liberal political views and given him a deep appreciation for democracy, putting him squarely at odds with the rising Nazi Party in his homeland. His adventurous modern life came to an abrupt end when his older, more favored brother died in a plane crash, forcing him to return to Germany to assume the unwanted role of heir to the defunct Hohenzollern legacy. The match was seen by their families as poetically logical, a union of two of modern Europe's grandest fallen imperial houses, the Russian double-headed eagle joining with the black eagle of Prussia. This was more than a marriage, it was a potent symbol of endurance, a joining of dynasties that shared a common fate of loss and exile. It was a comforting thought that their children would carry the blood of both Queen Victoria and Tsar Alexander II. Louis Ferdinand himself, a pragmatist, later wrote that their engagement felt like the natural and desirable culmination of a shared history and a mutual understanding of their strange place in the world. For Kira, who had only ever known the company of other Russian exiles, this worldly, experienced prince, from a family that understood her own, must have seemed like a lifeline. Their wedding in the spring of 1938 was a major event for the dwindling world of European royalty. It was a gathering of ghosts from a lost age, a final magnificent pageant of deposed monarchs and forgotten princelings. The guest list was a poignant roll call of irrelevance, Balkan kings without kingdoms, German dukes whose lands were now just names on an old map, and loyal Russian émigrés who wept openly to see their Tsar's daughter married. The ceremonies were elaborate, meticulously designed to honor both traditions. First, there was a Russian Orthodox service for Kira, conducted with all the solemn, incense-filled rites of the imperial court, held in Potsdam. It was a piece of Holy Russia, defiantly transplanted onto German soil. This was followed by a Lutheran service at Doorn in the Netherlands, the home of the exiled and aging Kaiser Wilhelm II, who with frail pride attended the celebration of his grandson's marriage. The atmosphere was a strange cocktail of defiant splendor, deep nostalgia, and a palpable undercurrent of anxiety for the future. This fairy tale union of fallen eagles, however, took place under the darkest and most menacing of shadows. By 1938, Germany was firmly in the iron grip of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. The Nazis were deeply suspicious of the old aristocracy, viewing the Hohenzollerns as a potential rival for the loyalty of the German people. Louis Ferdinand, with his famous name, his known liberal views, and his international connections, was a particular person of interest to the Gestapo. He was known to have quiet contacts within the conservative military and aristocratic circles that opposed Hitler. This meant he and his new bride would have to navigate their lives with extreme caution, living under the ever-watchful eye of a brutal, totalitarian state. Their mail would be read, their calls monitored, their friends noted. For Kira, who had spent her childhood fleeing the Red Terror of the Bolsheviks, this move to another police state must have felt like a terrifying case of déjà vu. Her new life as the Princess of Prussia began not in a peaceful kingdom, but at the heart of a brewing storm, in a country marching inexorably towards another catastrophic war. The Gilded Cage, a marriage of duty and disappointment on the surface. And for many years, the marriage of Kira and Louis Ferdinand was presented to the world as a picture of dynastic success. They were masters of the royal performance. They would host journalists for carefully staged photo shoots at their estates, presenting a dignified and united front to the world. These images, showing a handsome couple surrounded by a brood of healthy, well-dressed children, were meant to embody the stoic endurance of the old European royal order. They were the very model of a stable, noble family rising from the ashes of war. But as with so much of Kira's life, this polished public image concealed a far more complex and emotionally fraught private reality. It was a performance, and behind the curtain, the players were growing weary and distant. The Second World War plunged the family into a life of constant, gnawing anxiety that went far beyond the general hardships of wartime. Louis Ferdinand, while conscripted into a desk job in the Luftwaffe, was playing a dangerous double game. His known anti-Nazi sentiments were not passive. He used his position to gather information and maintain his connections to key figures in the German resistance. For Kira, this meant living with a quiet terror that was a terrifying echo of her childhood flight from the Bolsheviks. Every unexpected car on the road, every sharp knock on the door in the middle of the night could have been the Gestapo coming to take her husband away. She had to raise her young children amidst the chaos of air raids, gathering them in the cellar as bombs fell, trying to project a sense of calm while her own heart hammered with the fear of becoming a widow in a hostile land. When the 20th of July plot to assassinate Hitler failed in 1944, the regime's vengeance was swift and brutal. Thousands were arrested and executed. That Louis Ferdinand survived was a miracle, but he was interrogated by the Gestapo, an experience that would have chilled them both to the bone. After this ordeal came another cruel, rhyming blow of history. As the war drew to a close, their home in East Prussia was directly in the path of the advancing Soviet Red Army. Once again, the Romanov princess had to flee from the very force that had destroyed her world as a child. This was not a clandestine escape in a private car, but a chaotic, desperate trek westward in the brutal winter of 1944 to 45, caught up in the great German refugee crisis. With her young children in tow, Kira, now a German princess, was just another terrified refugee on the crowded, frozen roads, her royal status offering no protection from the biting cold or the advancing enemy. The family eventually found refuge in a small estate near Bremen in West Germany, and it was here that they attempted to rebuild their lives amidst the physical and psychological ruins of the post-war world. It was during these years of rebuilding that the fundamental, irreconcilable differences between Kira and her husband became a chasm that would define their marriage. Louis Ferdinand, invigorated by the creation of a new democratic Germany, threw himself into public life. He loved to fill their home with a diverse, sometimes bohemian crowd of artists, musicians, writers, and politicians. He thrived on intellectual debate and modern ideas. Kira, in contrast, was a product of her intensely insular upbringing. Raised in the backward-looking ritualistic world of a phantom Russian court, she was often reserved, uncomfortable, and visibly out of place in these lively, informal gatherings. While her husband embraced the future, a significant part of her remained anchored in the tragic, formal past. Her identity was Russian, her spirit shaped by the Orthodox faith, and the rigid etiquette of a world that prized form and tradition above all else. In Germany, she was always the outsider, a Russian Grand Duchess, whose life was now subsumed by the identity of the Prussian royal house. There has never been any concrete evidence of infidelity on Louis Ferdinand's part, but sources close to the family, including the memoirs of their own children, have painted a clear picture of a marriage that grew emotionally barren. It was a partnership founded on dynastic logic and a shared sense of duty, not on a passionate meeting of minds or hearts. Kira, who had spent her youth as a dutiful daughter, seamlessly transitioned into the role of a dutiful wife and mother. She ran the large household with quiet efficiency and was a devoted mother, but she was by many accounts a profoundly lonely woman. She had fulfilled her destiny. She had married a prince of equal rank and produced 7 heirs, but the simple human need for personal happiness and emotional intimacy seemed to have eluded her entirely. The deepest wounds, however, came not from the silence in her marriage, but from the choices of her children. The legacy of duty and sacrifice she had tried so hard to instill in them was rejected by the very generation meant to carry it forward. The most devastating blow was delivered by her eldest son and heir, Prince Friedrich Wilhelm. In a painful, almost theatrical echo of her own parents' story of defiance, Friedrich Wilhelm fell in love with a commoner. To marry the woman he loved, he was forced by the strict, unbending house laws of the Hohenzollerns, ancient laws which his own father, Louis Ferdinand, felt compelled to uphold for the sake of the institution, to renounce his sacred rights of succession. For Kira, this was an agony beyond comprehension. This was not just a matter of social standing. It was a spiritual crisis. She had dedicated her entire life to the abstract principle of dynastic purity, to the idea that personal desire must always be sacrificed for the good of the house. To see her own son, her heir, publicly declare that this legacy was not worth the sacrifice, that a personal love match was more important, must have felt like a fundamental repudiation of her entire life's purpose. The bitter irony that she, a child born of a defiant love match, would now be the staunchest defender of the very rules her parents broke, must have been excruciatingly painful. It was a bitter confirmation that the world she believed in with its rigid rules and hierarchies, was vanishing, not just in the wider world, but within the walls of her own home. Later, when another of her sons, Michael, also chose to marry a commoner, it was simply another turn of the knife. The modern world, with its irresistible emphasis on individual happiness, was relentlessly and cruelly chipping away at the very foundations of her identity. The weight of a life, a slow fade into sadness, the accumulated weight of these struggles and disappointments, layered one upon the other for decades, took a visible and heartbreaking toll on Kira in her later years. The post-war world, particularly the booming, modernizing Germany of the 1950s and 60s, was a place she never truly felt she belonged. It was a world of rock and roll, economic miracles, and a forward-looking energy that was utterly alien to her 19th century soul. As her children grew up and forged their own lives within this new reality, her sense of purpose began to wither. The slender, elegant princess of her youth, with her quiet dignity and melancholic eyes, slowly receded, replaced by a woman who seemed physically burdened by a deep, settled sadness. Friends and family noted her growing despondency and a profound withdrawal from the world, while her husband, Louis Ferdinand, remained an active and engaged public figure, giving interviews, managing the vast Hohenzollern estates and corresponding with world leaders. Kira began to retreat. She increasingly avoided the lively social events he enjoyed, finding the noise and conversation of his intellectual friends exhausting. Her world, which had once spanned the royal courts of Europe, began to shrink until it was confined to the quiet of her own rooms. There, surrounded by mementos of a lost Russia, she became a prisoner of her own past. The battle she had always fought with her weight, a lifelong struggle, was one she now seemed to lose all motivation to fight. Food became one of her few remaining comforts, a solace from the emptiness and a way to numb the persistent ache of disappointment. She neglected her health, and the physical consequences were severe. She suffered from debilitating high blood pressure and other serious health complications directly related to her significant weight gain. It was as if the constant low-grade sorrow of her life, the lost homeland she could barely remember, the phantom crown of her father that brought more burden than glory, the emotionally distant marriage, and the deep disillusionment with her children's choices had finally manifested itself physically. Chronic emotional pain has a way of etching itself onto the body, and Kira became a poignant case study. The vibrant blue of her famous Romanov eyes seemed to cloud over, and her once elegant posture grew stooped, as if she were physically carrying the invisible weight of her history. She had performed every duty asked of her with quiet, uncomplaining fortitude. She had been a dutiful daughter to difficult parents, a dutiful wife in a challenging marriage, and a prolific mother who secured the future of a great dynasty. But the personal fulfillment and simple human joy that should have been her reward never seemed to materialize. In her final years, she became the matriarch of a large and prominent family, surrounded by children and a growing number of grandchildren. Yet she seemed increasingly isolated, a lonely figure rattling around in the grand, empty halls of her own history. At large family gatherings, she was often a spectral presence, physically there, but emotionally absent, watching the boisterous lives of her descendants from a distant, sorrowful remove. She was a living relic of a world none of them had ever known, the guardian of traditions they didn't fully understand, or in the case of her eldest sons, had actively rejected. In the most tragic of ironies, the woman who had spent her life defined by her connection to two of Europe's greatest families ended her days feeling profoundly alone, a ghost long before her time. a quiet ending in a familiar refuge. The end, when it came, was not a long, drawn-out fade, but a sudden, merciful quietus. In its own way, it was poetically fitting. In the late summer of 1967, a weary and unwell Kira traveled to Saint-Briac-sur-Mer, the small, wind-swept Breton town that had been her family's first real anchor in the storm of their exile. This was more than just a place on a map. It was the landscape of her youth, the place where she had grown from a displaced child into a young woman burdened by a unique and heavy destiny. We can picture her there, walking the familiar rugged coastline, the scent of the salt spray the same as it was in her girlhood, a return to the one place on earth that felt unequivocally like home. She was there to visit her brother, Vladimir Kirillovich, the man who now carried the heavy imaginary mantle of emperor in exile that had once belonged to their father. Their bond was unique. They were the only two who had fully shared the surreal experience of that phantom court, and in her exhaustion, she likely sought the comfort of the one person who could truly understand the world that had shaped her. It was here, in the comforting presence of her brother, within the walls of the family villa that had been the heart of their miniature Russian world, that Grand Duchess Kirillovna, Princess of Prussia, collapsed from a massive heart attack. She died on September 8, 1967. She was only 58 years old. The end was so sudden it left her family reeling, in shock. The quiet, often sad, but constant presence at the center of their lives was simply gone. Her death was a quiet end to a life that had been framed by the loud, earth-shattering events of history. The journey of her body for burial was itself a symbol of her life's path. She was taken from the humble fishing village in France, the refuge of her Romanov heritage, and transported to the heart of Germany, the land of her husband's dynasty. She was buried not in the imperial crypts of St. Petersburg, where her ancestors lay, nor in the soil of France where she had spent so much of her life. Instead, her final resting place was in the grounds of Hohenzollern Castle. This was not a simple gravesite. Hohenzollern is a dramatic, almost fairy tale-like fortress, perched defiantly on a mountaintop, a symbol of ancient power and endurance. It was a final symbolic resting place for a woman whose entire life had been a bridge between the two great fallen dynasties she was born into and married into. In a final poignant acknowledgement of her own identity, she was interred in the castle's small, private, Russian Orthodox chapel. In the heart of a great German fortress, a small piece of Holy Russia was carved out just for her. It was the perfect, bittersweet epitaph, a Romanov Grand Duchess laid to rest as a Princess of Prussia, forever bridging the two worlds that had defined and in many ways constrained her. The legacy of a shadow princess. The story of Grand Duchess Kirillovna is not a story of grand achievements or historical influence. You will not find her name commanding chapters in history books. She left no political legacy, led no movements, and her name remains largely a footnote in the sprawling dramatic sagas of the Romanovs and the Hohenzollerns. And yet her significance lies in that very quietness. Her life is a powerful and deeply human testament to the collateral damage of history's great upheavals. She embodies the experience of an entire generation of displaced European aristocracy, people who were meticulously raised for a world that ceased to exist, leaving them adrift in a century that had little use for their titles or their training. Her story is a microcosm of the end of an entire social order, where the personal pain of one family reflected the death of a world. Her life was a lived-out paradox, a constant negotiation between a magnificent name and a diminished reality. She was an imperial highness who knew the gnawing hardship of being a refugee. She was a princess who carried the weight of two of Europe's greatest imperial names, yet she found herself powerless to stop her own children from rejecting the very traditions that gave those names meaning. Their choice to marry for love wasn't just a family drama, it was a clear signal that the world had changed, that the age of dynastic duty was giving way to an age of individualism. Her story compels us to look beyond the glittering tiaras and the formal titles and to see the real person beneath, a woman bound by a sense of duty so profound, so deeply ingrained in her from birth, that it often came at the direct expense of her own happiness. It reveals the immense, grinding psychological toll of carrying a lost legacy, the pressure of being a living symbol for a monarchist, cause she never chose, the survivor's guilt of having escaped the fate of her murdered relatives, and the quiet, hollowing void left when the one purpose you were raised for is completely erased by history.